Welcome to Afrometrics, research-based news podcast, and we're joined by Natalie Watson-Singleton, PhD, to discuss a recent study she conducted along with her co-authors, Jordan Pennefather and Teresa Trusty. The study they conducted was called, "Can a Culturally Responsive Mobile Health Application Reduce African American Stress?" Dr. Watson-Singleton received her PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. She completed her clinical psychology pre-doctoral internship at Emory University in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She's currently an assistant professor at Spelman College, and she is Diversity and Inclusion Education Director with the NIA Project at Emory University Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Watson strongly identifies as a clinical community psychologist, which is reflected in her scholarship, her teaching, and clinical community work. Also, as a trained clinical psychologist, she aims to produce research that is translational. She works to bridge the science and practice to develop and implement prevention and treatment programs that are innovative, culturally responsive, and promote optimal health among diverse groups, which is evident in the research that we'll be talking to her about today. Consistent with her training and values, her program of research includes two lines of inquiry. One focuses on understanding how stressful events like trauma and cultural factors like race-related stress interact to influence African Americans' health disparities, with special attention to African American women. Specifically, she has examined how gender, race, and socioeconomic status intersect to shape African American women's psychological help-seeking attitudes, health behaviors, and outcomes such as depression, alcohol abuse, and suicide. And that's directly related to the work that she does with the NIA Project at Emory University. Her second programmatic line examines if mind-body interventions reduce adverse health outcomes for African Americans and how to culturally modify those interventions to increase African Americans' use of these services. Her most recent project, which is funded by the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, involves developing a culturally responsive mindfulness mHealth application for African Americans and investigating its effectiveness in a fully powered randomized clinical trial. The study that she's talking about today is exactly related to that. This is a study that caught my attention. I was talking to Dr. Watson-Singleton before we started about the interesting combination between empirical research, race-specific research, and cultural relevance. A combination I think that is rare, I think, especially with empirical research. So this is a great article, and Dr. Watson-Singleton has many others actually discovered in the lead up to our conversation today. I just looked at some of the other work that you've done on the Strong Black Women thesis, the impact of racial discrimination and depressive symptoms. I mean, a very interesting concept that I hope to ask you about a little later, the work that you've done on self-compassion. I want to ask you a question about that later on. And I think in looking at those articles that you have written, those studies that you published, you talk about topics like emotional support, emotional regulation, emotional dysregulation. But that to me seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but that seems like a trend that runs throughout your writing, those topics. So can you talk about how you became interested in the topic of emotional regulation and mindfulness?
Yeah, I think there are multiple ways that I got to those topics. If I think about where my research started, even as an undergrad, so I was a fortunate undergraduate student who was able to get involved with research my junior year, and then was part of the psychology honors program. So did a honors thesis my senior year of undergraduate school. And my senior thesis really was interested in this broad question of how do Black women understand their Black woman identity? What does it mean to be a Black woman. And across all of the women who differed in terms of their region, in terms of the part of the country that they lived in, their age, their unique socialization experiences, all of them talked about strength and this idea of strong Black womanhood. And when I got to graduate school, really wanted to understand what this schema was, right? Like it was something that resonated with me. If I think about my own socialization as a Black woman, this how I've observed the Black women in my life, such as my mom, my grandmothers, my aunts, and something that was so foundational to this construct was that when you encounter stress, what do? You keep it moving, you push through. And in my mind, as I started to learn more and more about psychology and develop as a clinician, I was like, keeping it moving is an emotion regulatory process, right? This idea that we don't have the luxury to feel our emotions. We don't have the luxury to fully sit with and understand our emotions because our families need us, our communities need us, and we have to keep it moving. And so there are ways in which that regulatory process has been fundamental to our survival as Black women, but also as Black people. And it was also costing us if we started to look at the research. So started to find that this schema was related to anxiety, was related to depression, was related to feeling as if you actually had less social support in your life. And so I started to really, wonder about that, right? This idea of strength seems so important to our communities. I think we also hear it talked about in really positive ways, right? We know that Congresswoman Maxine Waters referred to herself as a strong Black woman just a couple of years ago and talking about going up against the Trump campaign. And at the same time, as I started my own personal journey with mindfulness, I started to wonder about if mindfulness was another option. So if strong Black womanhood tells us to keep it moving, that we don't have the space to sit with our emotions, might mindfulness be another message, another practice, another way of relating to our emotions? And so this is work that has really evolved over time through both research experiences and my own personal experiences.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think this, you may have already partially answered this already. What then led to this particular experiment on the impact of culturally responsive mobile health on African-American stress?
Yeah. So my third year of graduate school, I was introduced to mindfulness through a personal practice. And I remember going on my first mindfulness retreat and really being struck by so many of the characteristics of it that felt really off-putting and unfamiliar. So walking into the retreat space and there being cushions on the floor to sit, and then walking into the space and seeing a Buddha statue in the front of the room, walking in the space and seeing different types of, being asked to take my shoes off. Things that were not culturally familiar to me, and especially not culturally familiar in walking into a space where also too, that was full of white folks, right? So I'm not used to sitting in a space with white folks sitting on the floor, leaving our shoes by the door. And although those things might be culturally significant to other cultures, it wasn't how I was sort of socialized. So if I think about, growing up and going to church, it wasn't common to take our shoes off. We weren't necessarily sitting on cushions. But I remember that experience being so powerful and really was helpful in learning new ways about how to relate to my thoughts, how to relate to my emotions, how to relate to the sensations in my body, such as tension in the shoulders, where we can tend to keep a lot of stress. And so then I started teaching mindfulness at our psychological clinic at U of I. And not once did we have a Black person participate. And again, at this time, I was doing research on strong Black womanhood, really engulfed in the literature on health disparities. And so I was like, if we know if we have all of this research about all of the health disparities that Black communities experience, and then we have this thing over here called mindfulness that seems to do a lot of good work in terms of decreasing depression, decreasing anxiety, improving blood pressure, improving sleep. But if we look around and the only people in the room are white folks who are not experiencing these disparities, there's a disconnect, which led me to wonder, like, why is there a disconnect? And part of it was like, well, if I think about my own experience going into traditional mindfulness spaces or white centric mindfulness spaces, there's a lot of things about it, again, that are off putting. There's a way in which they talk about mindfulness that does not feel familiar or resonate. And so, what kinds of changes might we need to do to make mindfulness more appealing or relevant to our communities?
Okay. And so you talked a little bit just there about the impact of mindfulness, but can you define it? Can you explain what mindfulness is?
Yeah, in its most basic sense, mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment in a way that's curious and non judgmental. And that's whatever comes up for you in the present moment. So, what emotion you're having in the present moment, what thought you're having in the present moment, what's happening in your body in the present moment, and being able to attend to those things without judgment, which I have noticed is really difficult and challenging for people, right? So if we think about, the work that I've done, even with clients, if you notice that you feel sad, judging yourself for feeling sad. Well, why am I feeling this way? There are people who have it worse than me. Oh, that just means I'm ungrateful. So then we start to judge ourselves for having the emotion, which then makes us feel worse. Mindfulness teaches us that we can pay attention to our emotion and not have to judge ourselves, that experiencing these emotions are just part of the human process.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I appreciate that because this clarifies some of the things that you talk about in your article. That concept of non-judgment, I think, is very important. So, as far as right now, there are a lot of things that can cause stress, just in mainstream sense of things that are happening in our environment. But you do talk about how there's been recent increases in measures of African American stress levels. And what do you think the causes of those increased stress levels are? And then what are the consequences of stress on health?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to racism, right? What contributes to these increased stress levels? I think it's the persistent and cumulative racism that we as a community experience on multiple levels, right? So not just the racism that we experience individually, right? So the microaggressions I may face going into the office or going into my workplace or going into my classroom, but also the cultural racism. So living in a society that does not really value our presence in the society, or even if we think about the realities of cultural appropriation, right? We see things taken from our communities and celebrated when they're practiced by other people, but not when they're practiced by us. And then racism that's manifested at the institutional level. So thinking about significant unemployment that negatively and disproportionately impacts our community. We can even think about the realities of COVID right now. We've seen various structural level ways that racism has manifested in terms of our communities being disproportionately impacted by COVID. So having less access to adequate care, having the kinds of jobs that still require us going into work rather than working from home, all of those things compounded create an environment that is stressful and that continues to be stressful. And no matter how much we speak out about this, it seems like it continues to be invalidated and pushed to the side. So I think that that also contributes to the increased stress. And just in terms of the consequences of that increased stress are the very real health disparities that are evidenced in our community. So the increased cardiovascular disease, the increase high blood pressure. I think about 48% of Black women have hypertension compared to 42 to 45% of African American men who have hypertension. That's almost 50% of our populations walking around with hypertension, which we know is a significant risk factor for heart attack and stroke.
And another really interesting thing that you talk about in your paper is that there are coping mechanisms that we make use of that we think are helping us that are actually contributing to worse health. And you talked about strong black woman thesis. I don't know if you include that in this, but can you talk about what some of those things are that are coping mechanisms that people have that they think are helping them that are actually contributing to worse health?
Yeah, I think in general, some of those things are practices such as avoidance or numbing. So avoidance could look like sleeping too much, right? So when you are living in a stressful environment, or if it feels like day after day after day is you're having to confront racism, we might see this disrupting sleep. And disruption of sleep could look like sleeping too much. We also see numbing out, so using substances as a way to numb the pain, excessive shopping or impulsive shopping as a way to numb the pain. I think in the paper, one of the strategies, the coping strategies that I highlighted was what we call John Henryism. So, a term that's been used in the psychology literature, but even beyond the psychology literature, is this idea of John Henryism. John Henry being this symbol of African American folklore who basically worked himself to death. And we see some overlaps in John Henryism and also strong Black womanhood, but this idea that we have been socialized to almost work our way out of stress, or no matter how many obstacles we experience, to continue to push through, to continue to persevere, to continue to overcome. And it's actually hurting our bodies. In fact, the research around John Henryism shows that it's actually associated with increased cardiovascular disease. The work on strong Black womanhood shows that it's associated with increased depression, anxiety, disordered eating. So trying to eat away the pain.
Wow. Yeah. This is an interesting point because in a racial environment, it has been a part of African American racial socialization, some African American racial socialization styles to prepare Black children to be strong.
Yep, to work twice as hard. Yep, to be strong, to work twice as hard, to overcome. And I think ultimately, and even in the highlighting of John Henryism or strong Black womanhood, it's not to pathologize Black folks. It makes sense that we're coping in these ways, right? We've had to push through, we've had to overcome, we've had to persevere. So for things to truly improve, we have to end racism. We have to create a society in which we don't have to do that anymore. I think the hope with mindfulness or other types of strategies is that we can learn to make space for ourselves to practice other options. So yes, you may have to use that John Henryism or that strong Black womanhood coping strategy when you go into the workplace, but when you come home, can you put it down? Yes, you might have to work twice as hard when you go into the classroom or when you step outside your home, but can you give yourself spaces throughout the day for other ways of being?
Yeah, very important point I think you just made about not pathologizing African American culture, and you're talking about in your paper these practices that can be incorporated and mindful practices. You talked about what mindfulness is. Can you give some examples of mindful practices? Because you use the term mindful practices in your writing. Yes.
Yeah, so there are multiple mindfulness practices. So some of the common practices have to do with just breathing exercises. So paying attention to your breath, bringing your focus and attention to your breath in a given moment, whether that's for 2 minutes, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes. There are other practices that include what's commonly referred to as the body scan. This is where you scan the body, typically from head to toe, to check in with, are there different parts of the body that are holding tension? Are you noticing that your jaw is clenched? Are you noticing that you're kind of sitting with your shoulders up towards your ears rather than letting them fall? Are you noticing that there's pain in the lower back? And how do you focus your attention there and almost like breathe into that part of the body and feel the tension kind of dissipate over time? Those are some of the common mindfulness practices, but one of the things that I often also like to highlight for people is that mindfulness doesn't just have to be practiced formally, right? You don't have to just do a breathing practice or a body scan. Anytime you bring your attention to the present moment, you're being mindful. So anytime you're having a conversation with someone and you're actually listening to what they're saying rather than thinking about something else or anticipating what you're going to say next, you're being mindful. When you're in the shower and just noticing the sensation of the water hitting your body and bringing your full attention there, that's a practice of mindfulness. And so for me, it's really about encouraging folks to bring this attitude of mindfulness to multiple areas of their life.
Okay. And I think you might have just made some people who are listening mindful about their posture and how they're thinking. I know that was crossing my mind as I was listening. So mobile health. What is mobile health, and why do you believe that mobile health can be particularly impactful for African Americans?
Yeah, mobile health just means using our phone or any other wireless device to promote health. So when we're using our phone to track how many steps we've taken, or we're using a Fitbit to track how many steps we've taken, when we're using our tablet to watch a health video or to go through a nutritional class, those are any way that we incorporate technology into our health practice is really consumed under the umbrella of mHealth or mobile health. The reason why there's been increased attention to mobile health is, I think in general, because it has to do with increased accessibility. So everybody may not be able to see a therapist. Everybody may not be able to get to see a physician regularly, may not be able to get to their clinic. There may not even be clinics in, their neighborhood, especially if we're thinking about rural communities. And so mHealth or mobile health applications really just take that health information and make it more accessible. The reason why I care about it in my work, especially, my work with African American communities, is because mHealth approaches really do eliminate a lot of the barriers that keep Black folks from being able to use services. So mHealth approaches are typically relatively cheap or free, right? So there's a lot of apps out there that are free to use or relatively low cost. So it might be, more cost effective to pay $1.99 for an app than to see a therapist every week. There also aren't transportation barriers associated with downloading an app or having an app on your phone. And we know that transportation barriers are a huge barrier to African American communities taking advantage of various health services. And there's usually not stigma right? If you're doing something on your phone, it's not like everybody's in your business, but there's a lot of fear about showing up to a therapist's office or showing up to different kinds of clinics and things like that. And so there are a lot of advantages to mHealth, especially in our communities.
Yeah. And you went beyond just kind of an abstract discussion of mobile health. In your paper, you actually described an experiment that you ran, a study that you did. And so I do want to ask you to talk about this Mindful You app that was created, and just kind of paint the picture of the design of the experiment that you conducted.
Yeah, so the work that I started doing with mindfulness really started with qualitative research, really going around and talking to different African Americans about if we were going to offer mindfulness in our communities, what might it need to look like? And so, if I think about the development of the Mindful You app, which is an app that was created by me and a tech team out of Oregon called Trifoya. So, myself and Trifoya were awarded an NIH grant, the National Institute of Health, to create this mindfulness app specifically for African Americans. And so it really was a blessing to take that qualitative data and then translate it into content. So thinking about everything that we've collected in our interviews, people saying, well, number one, the people providing the practices need to be Black. When we turn on the app, we want to hear voices that sound like ours. We want to hear people talk about values that are important to our communities. We want to hear them talking about interdependence, strength, empowerment, spirituality. Talk to us about how we can use these practices in our lives. And so it was, again, really just a blessing to use that qualitative data to inform content. And so what we did is we created an app that has multiple mindfulness practices, again, all voiced by Black folks, that target different themes that are important to our communities, that also included inspirational quotes from folks in our communities, so quotes from Maya Angelou, to sort of ground the practices. And people use the app. So in terms of the data collection, people use the app for 2 weeks. And what we found is that after a 2-week period, their reports of stress were lower. They felt more in charge of their emotions, and they reported using more mindfulness.
Wow. Okay, that is a question that I had, and you just answered. I was going to ask you to talk about how the app was culturally relevant.
Yeah. So
Right.
yeah, the process of developing a culturally responsive app was multi-layered. So the one layer of, drawing from my own lived experience, but also the layer of using qualitative data from various African Americans that we had interviewed about this process by highlighting themes that are so important to our communities. Again, things like spirituality, things such as empowerment. And if we really even think about this current moment, if we think about mindfulness, and one of the key practices of mindfulness, as I mentioned previously, is about focusing on the breath. What does it mean to focus on the breath in a Black body with Eric Gardner's I Can't Breathe in the background? Being able to make that connection so that people, again, are understanding how these practices have been developed for our communities, are making clear connections to the things that we're experiencing. Yeah. So again, rooting those practices in the literature around racial trauma, but also cultural strengths, right? I didn't want this to just be an app that was focused on targeting oppression, but also making space for Black joy, for rest, for leisure, for play, because we are a multifaceted community. And so making space for those things in the app.
Wow. Thank you. I appreciate that. And there's one thing that that this makes me think about, and it's one thing to take a instrument or to take a intervention that was not designed to serve Black people and to make it relevant for Black people. But I thought it was very significant that you mentioned that you did the qualitative research first. You talked to Black people, and I have to mention one of my research methods professor told us our class, it was a kind of a mantra that we were taught to internalize, that I will speak to the people before I speak for the people, you know. But it's important that you did that qualitative work first. You talked to the community, you found those common things and normed the intervention or the app on the community, you know.
Yeah. And it's something that, you know, to be honest, we still get pushback around. You know, some people are like, well, why mindfulness? What if the community said they didn't want mindfulness, they wanted something else? And so acknowledging that we went in with the ideas around culturally tailoring mindfulness. But one of the things that has become even clearer to me in this work is that although I started with the idea of like, okay, how can we take this thing, mindfulness, and make it culturally responsive? What I realized is that we've been doing mindfulness. We weren't calling it mindfulness, but we've been doing this. And so in some ways, it was almost like a reclaiming too of those practices that were indigenous to our communities. And so there's a scholar, Veronica Womack from Northwestern, Dr. Veronica Womack, who did a paper in 2017 that looked at mindfulness in racial socialization messages. And one of the things that she often talks about is growing up and her grandmother getting her ready for school and the time that they would take to put lotion on. She was like, that's a mindfulness practice. When you pause and slow down and take the time to put lotion on, right? Like that was mindfulness. If you think about growing up with family and, you know, snapping peas on the porch, that's a mindfulness practice. And so one of the things that has come up for me in this work is how this is, again, a reclaiming of things that we've been doing. And it's just about using our language to describe them.
Wow. Again, I think another important point, because it sounds like you're saying that mindfulness is something that's built into African-American cultural practices.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to recognize. So we don't get the idea that if we want healing, we have to go look outside of our own culture.
Yeah.
You know? Wow. So you talked about the findings. One question I wanted to ask. So looking at the method section, right, of your paper, and you talk about the population, the sample, and the age range was 18 to 73. So this made me think of my aunts, my uncles, my mom. And I was wondering if you felt that technology did it turn out to be a factor at all in the research?
It's an excellent it's an excellent question, and it's one that we get a lot. Because the sample size for this particular study was too small, we weren't able to actually look at age differences. But as you mentioned, we did have a significant spread, 18 to 73. However, from previous data, we know that the folks who are most likely to use tech-based health resources are going to be folks in that 18 to 35 age range. So one of the things that is on my radar and that I'm excited about is we're starting our next phase of data collection to increase our sample size. I'll be curious to see if we see age differences emerge. But I also think there's going to need to be continued research about who this app serves well and who it doesn't. It could be that this app doesn't serve older folks well. And so then it's about, well, then what can we create to serve older folks well, or folks, you know, over 35? And so I think the app is a start, and it's not the end all be all.
Right. But you did talk about the impact that it did have. Can you say a little bit more about those findings, the results, the impact that it
Yeah.
had?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so people reported less stress.
Mhm.
So we measured their stress before they engaged with the app, and then we measured their stress afterwards. They reported reductions in stress. They also reported improved ability to manage their emotions, so feeling more empowered over how to handle their emotions. They also reported using mindfulness more. And we also collected some qualitative data. What was also interesting is that the participants shared, both men and women shared, that it was relevant to their lives. And I think that was one of the things that I also cared about is, yes, we created this app for African Americans, and also tell us if it was relevant to you. And so I'm excited about both the quantitative and qualitative data.
Okay, so can you talk about how this happens, right? They receive messages, the participants, electronic
So
messages. Mhm.
So in it's on their phone, they're instructed to go to the app store to download the app. In the app, there are pre-recorded health practices. So such as the breathing exercise, such as scanning their body, such as being able to notice their emotions without judgment, being able to pay attention to their thoughts and then practice letting the thoughts go. So there were these different practices that they could access that had different themes. And they could also set reminders for themselves if they wanted to carve out set periods of time throughout the week to practice. And they could also, and yes, they received messages, inspirational messages that motivated them to use the app over the 2 week period.
Okay, and one of the things it resulted in was lower stress levels.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
And
So it was
behavior and
effective.
behave
And
and behavior change, right? So they were reporting less stress, but they were also reporting using mindfulness more.
okay, and what are some of those behavioral changes?
Yeah, so with the using mindfulness more, such as taking more time to focus on their breathing, actually paying attention to their body, actually going through the process of like, okay, I'm noticing that I'm having tension in my chest right now. Can I imagine this tension kind of dissipating as I breathe more deeply? So, because one of the things I don't think I mentioned, but part of how mindfulness works is it also regulates our nervous system. When we
Hmm.
experience stress, we not only experience intense emotions, but our body responds. We have increased cortisol, the stress hormone that's released into the body. And so part of how we understand mindfulness to work is not only does it change our relationship to our thoughts and our emotions, but it also signals to the body that we're safe, we're okay. It can kind of let that nervous system calm down.
Wow. What do you envision as the future of mindfulness based interventions, like the pilot that you did?
My hope for mindfulness based interventions broadly is that there is more attention on who's included and who's excluded. There has been so much increased work on mindfulness. There's a study that I often cite that was done, I believe, in 2018. And what they found is that in the last 10, 15 years, there's actually been over 12,000 citations of mindfulness. And I think only 12 to 15 of those had a specific diversity focus. Over 12,000 mindfulness studies, and only really a handful focusing on issues related to race, ethnicity, aspects of diversity, such as what language it's offered in. And so, my hope is that scholars, clinicians will pay more attention to this. My hope for my specific program of research and thinking about the app is continued research about who the app serves well and who it doesn't. Again, oftentimes when I give this, when I talk about my research, people are like, oh, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about this? And I'm like, some of them I have. And my hope is really to make the app largely available so that other scholars, other researchers can continue to understand, uh, again, who the app works for and who it doesn't. So does the app work for Black youth? Does it work for Black pregnant women? Does it work for folks who are incarcerated? So really thinking about the diversity within our communities and who the app serves.
Okay. And you have focused on Black women in a lot of your research. And what you mentioned in terms of your results reminded me of that concept of allostatic load.
Yes,
This
exactly.
the kind of impact on the body, how stress impacts the body through hormone levels, et cetera. And PBS had this documentary a while back. I think it's been a long time now, but it was a several part series, but one part was called When the Bow Breaks, and brought, I think, a lot of people's attention to something that was happening for a long time, but infant mortality experienced with Black women and in childbirth.
Yeah.
And you have actually done another study or another paper that was published. I forgot what journal that was published in, but it was on perinatal stress and mindfulness.
Yeah.
And you present mindfulness as something that could potentially mitigate perinatal stress and adverse health outcomes for pregnant Black women. Can you talk about that a little more?
And so that paper was a theoretical paper where we start to make the argument for, if we really want to show up for Black women who are either planning to get pregnant, trying to get pregnant, who are pregnant, or who are in the postpartum or perinatal period. So this is sort of a year to 2 years out of having a child. If we really want to show up for them, we're going to have to get creative. The rates are staggering if we really consider how dangerous it is for Black women to go through childbirth in this nation. And again, mindfulness just being one tool. I think there's so much that we have to do on the systems change level, right? Being able to eradicate those inequities. But what are those tools that we can provide Black women in the here and now to help them manage that stress?
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind to me as well is this. I mean, and you've written about racial discrimination and it's how it can lead to depressive symptoms, but looking at how frequently our eyes, our brains are being exposed to stimuli in the form of images of police killing Black people dying, being killed, video, audio, still images, etc. All of this stimuli. You talk about the concept of emotional dysregulation on a mass level through the media. What effect do you believe that the exposure to these images are having?
I think they're having a multifaceted and profound impact on us. And there are so many scholars who I really appreciate who are doing this work around racial trauma. That's how racial trauma works, not just through direct experience, but through vicarious experiencing. That's what happens every time that we're seeing another video, turning on the news, looking at an image, seeing something on social media. That is vicarious experiencing of that traumatic event and a reminder of how unsafe we can feel in our bodies in this nation. And yeah, it's impacting us psychologically in terms of our emotional experience, in terms of what we think, and also affecting our behaviors and our physiology. So going back to what you talked about in terms of allostatic load, right? Just the vigilance, the on guardness that is embodied by so many of us every time we step foot out of our house.
And then you say something else in one of your articles. You're talking about, I mean, it sounded Fanonian to me. In France, it reminded me of Frantz Fanon in a sense, because you talked about how activism can actually play a role in the healing process.
Yeah.
Can you expand on what you meant by that? That activism could mitigate the relationship between a racially discriminatory event and it developing into stress. You mentioned how engaging in activism can mitigate that relationship. Can you say
Yeah.
more?
Yeah. I am just also really loving the scholars who are coming out and talking about things such as radical healing. And part of that radical healing conceptualization often includes consciousness raising, includes participation in activism. And the paper that you're talking about, what we did is we looked at the health benefits of engaging in Black Lives Matter activism specifically for African Americans. And what we found is that in a longitudinal design where we were actually tracking people over time, that engaging in BLM activism was actually protective against depression over time. And I think part of that is it's community building. It is coalition building. It is also connecting with a greater sense of purpose. People feel more purposeful, more efficacious, more connected. And it's one way to transform rage into power, right? So if we think about how depression operates, one of the key characteristics of depression is hopelessness and helplessness. When you engage in activism, you're turning that on its head. I'm not helpless and hopeless if I'm out there fighting for change.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's part of the healing power of activism.
Wow, I'm glad that you made that point. That was a really interesting argument that you made in the paper too. I think that's important to. I'm not sure a lot of people take that into consideration. So I want to address some of the other things that you've written. So you did a study where you looked at the validation of the difficulties of emotional regulation scale, and I thought that it was significant that you had a sample of Black women and you wanted to validate the scale on a sample of Black women. How often do you think that that's done? That someone says, okay, before I use this study on and test it on a sample of on Black people, that I first validated on a sample of Black people first. How often do you think that happens?
I don't think it happens widely, but I think more and more people are paying attention to it. You know, if we say culture matters, then we also have to acknowledge that culture can differentially impact how we experience the world around us, which includes mental health phenomena. And so if we think about the difficulties of emotion regulation scale, or really it's a scale aimed to measure emotion regulation, it was not developed with African American folks in mind. And so the question became, well, if we really want to understand emotion regulation in our communities, is this the best scale? That's ultimately what validation is interested in, looking at these measures that have largely been developed and normed on white samples, asking the question of, do they fit for us or do they not? There may be some reason to suggest, there may be some reasons to think that certain things are universal and fit across groups. But again, going back to some of the stuff that we talked about previously in terms of strong Black womanhood and John Henryism, that has all of this messaging about how we handle our emotions as Black people, I wasn't certain that this measure would work for us. And so we carried out a validation to see. And what we found is that there were certain aspects of it that did fit, but I think it requires continued research.
This I ask you to correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but it seems to me that in your research you're going a little bit past cultural relevant to cultural specific.
Yes.
You make a call for culturally tailored interventions.
Yeah.
Is that the next step? Do we need to be going beyond this word? It seems to be picking up actually a use, but in terms of its meaning, it seems to be losing some meaning, cultural relevance. You seem to be going in the direction of cultural specific
Yeah.
research and intervention here.
Yeah, no, I think that I think it's a tension and one that we have to continue to pay attention to. Again, with the overarching question of who do these interventions serve? Who were they created for? Who provides them? Who do they work for? And how could we make them better? Again, for me, really with that health equity and health disparity frame in the background. If this is really about improving health for all people, that has to include communities that are experiencing disparate health, such as African American communities. And how do we get there? And being able to acknowledge when what we currently have doesn't work and is insufficient.
Yeah, very powerful research. Is there anything that you wanted to add that we haven't had a chance to discuss?
I think you have been quite thorough in your questions. And so I feel like we've covered a lot of good ground. And so I just want to thank you for the invite. Thank you for having these kinds of conversations. I think it's so important, not only that we do the research, but that we think of other creative ways to make the research accessible.
Well, I think that that your research is very inspiring. The fact that you have stuck to your this cultural specific focus, again, that you have brought together cultural relevance, empirical work, and a concept that you use. You're very intentional about referring to describing your work or describing yourself as a clinical community psychologist.
Yeah. I had, the rare advantage of being in a clinical community program, that there are so many psychology programs in the US and abroad that are either clinical psychology or community psychology, not that really bridge the strengths of both into one training program. And the University of Illinois is just really unique in that way. And if we think about clinical and community psychology, clinical psychology is very much focused on what it calls sort of problems in living. Like how do we understand problems in living? How do we understand depression and anxiety? And the things that either increase risk or are protective for those things, but often limited to the individual level. Community psychology calls on us to really reflect on these things that we call quote unquote problems in living are systemic. They're things that are reinforced by the systems in which we occupy. Those include family systems, those include neighborhood contexts, those include historical moments in time, those include the different kinds of systems and institutions that we interact with. And so whenever I am thinking about this work, and even the work around mindfulness, yes, mindfulness works. And how can we think about mindfulness just beyond the individual? How can we really pull from community and culturally based strengths into our mindfulness program? And not just disseminating mindfulness individually, but how can we even think about reducing accessibility barriers to mindfulness, which is where the technology piece comes in, right? So, how do we create mindfulness content, but then make it widely accessible so that folks aren't burdened by needing a certain type of insurance, needing a certain type of income, needing a certain type of transportation? All the while not losing sight of, we can't just teach Black folks how to cope better. We need to change the system so that they're not having to constantly live day in and day out in a racist society.
Wow, that is reminiscent to me of Jules Sorrell.
Yeah.
He wrote the Manichean Psychology book, but talks about I think he gives it a fish analogy. I think like if you can take fish out of a toxic fish tank and heal them, but if you put them back in the same fish tank, then how much are you really changing?
Yeah.
But yeah, very important. I think that blending cultural relevance, empirical work, community focus, very rare. And I think people will be hearing about your scholarship more. You seem to be publishing quite prolifically. So I'm expecting more of the same in the future. Graduate students, I think if you're listening, you heard, if you're interested in clinical community psychology, then University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana,
Yeah.
a good choice.
Yeah.
Okay. Any social media that you can mention that where people can find out more about you?
Yeah, so folks are more than welcome to follow me on Instagram, Dr._Nat_psychologist. So Dr. Nat Psychologist. Um, Also, folks are more than welcome to check me out on my website at nwswellness.com, the NWS Natalie Watson-Singleton Wellness.com. And the website provides a nice overview of some of the work that I'm doing in the community, some of the work that I'm doing in therapy, as well as consultation work.
All right. And Dr. Watson-Singleton, do you have a message for prospective or potential graduate students who want to go and follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, I think, there's so many things I could say, but one of the things that also stands out to me is being true to yourself. And what I mean by that is, I think when I showed up to graduate school, I had a lot of hopes and dreams in terms of what that would look like. And there is a way in which academia socializes you into a certain way of thinking. And I'm grateful for all of the mentors that I had alongside the way to really encourage me to stay true to myself. That yes, learning the academic lingo, learning the academic game is important. And ultimately, I showed up in these spaces to help my communities. And so, how can I help my communities through these new tools, whether it be through grant funding, whether it be through publications, whether it be through creating content and interventions for us by us? And so, recognizing, that in a lot of ways, the academic institution is not set up to serve you, but making sure that you seek out community, that you stay true to yourself, that you seek out mentors who can keep you rooted and grounded in those things that you know to be true.
Wow, that was a great message. And thank you for taking out time to join us. I think that in the future your schedule is going to be busy, but we'll be able to say that
it started
interviewed
here.
You Afrometrics, research-based news. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you all, and join us again next week for a new episode. And I'd like to dedicate this episode of our podcast to my cousin, Ira Edwards. Welcome home.